Hey everyone, in today's video, I want to set the record straight on privatizing Social Security and show you all the surprising truth of where this proposal came from. But before we get there, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Devin Carroll, and this is my YouTube channel where I break down Social Security and attempt to make it easier to understand. So if you're planning for or maybe even living in retirement, this channel is for you, so be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I don't want you to miss anything that I publish. Now, if you've watched any of my latest videos, you know that I'm stirred up about the inability of our politicians to do anything about fixing Social Security. They're all so caught up in the preservation of their political future, they just hope a solution drops from the sky that doesn't raise taxes or cut benefits. It's maddening. We've created this retirement system that just keeps getting bigger and more complex, which makes retirees increasingly reliant on the government for their retirement income, which in turn discourages personal savings. Look, the system has done a lot of good for a lot of people, but FDR never envisioned a program like the one we have today. But as they say, it is what it is. This is the program we have, and payroll taxes are being collected in exchange for the implied promise of benefits being there tomorrow. So someone needs to get to work fixing this because things are about to get ugly for Social Security. By 2034, benefits will be cut by 25% if nothing is done, period. Let's be real clear. The final solution is going to either be a tax increase or a benefit cut, and most likely a combination of both. And that's pain for whoever is on either side of that. There just isn't enough revenue coming in to meet the benefits that need to be paid out. And this is sad because it didn't have to be this way. There was a third option to fix Social Security that got really close to implementation in the late 90s. And if it would have been used, we wouldn't have any of the issues with the solvency of Social Security that we have today. Here's a quick snapshot of the problem. The Social Security Trust Fund has a $2.9 billion balance. Now, by law, this balance is mandated to be invested into the special obligation bonds, which are direct obligations of the United States Treasury. In 2019, the special obligation bonds paid 2.8% in interest. For comparison, the stock market was up 31.49%. Now, that's certainly not the return of the stock market in most years, but as we'll see here in a moment, the stock market has produced returns much higher than the special obligation bonds. Now, this, when you look at the two returns side by side, raises the question, instead of investing that massive amount of money into low-interest treasury bonds, why don't we take at least part of it and put it in the stock market? Now, this concept is most often referred to as privatizing Social Security. Now, for those of you pre-programmed not to like that idea, just because your flavor of political party said they don't like it, please keep an open mind and stick with me on this, and you may be surprised where this idea originally came from. Privatizing Social Security was first proposed by a Democrat in the late 90s. The idea was also strongly promoted by the next administration, which just happened to be Republican. At this point, the Democrats changed their position, though, and nearly overnight, they were very against the idea of privatization. By the time Obama was elected, it was well established the Democrats wouldn't support any proposal that included investing the assets of the trust fund.
One thing we can't afford to do, though, is privatize Social Security, an ill-conceived idea that would add trillions of dollars to our budget deficit while tying your benefits to the whims of Wall Street traders and the ups and downs of the stock market. A few years ago, we had a debate about privatizing Social Security, and I'd have thought that debate would have been put to rest once and for all by the financial crisis we've just experienced. I'd have thought, after being reminded how quickly the stock market can tumble, after seeing the wealth people worked a lifetime to earn wiped out in a matter of days, that no one would want to place bets with Social Security on Wall Street, that everyone would understand why we need to be prudent about investing the retirement money of tens of millions of Americans. But some Republican leaders in Congress don't seem to have learned any lessons from the past few years. They're pushing to make privatizing Social Security a key part of their legislative agenda if they win a majority in Congress this fall.
Now, there are two issues that I have with his statement. First, I think it was extremely patronizing to assume the American people don't understand the fundamentals of the stock market. Saying that the wealth people have worked for a lifetime could be wiped out in a matter of days, I think is beyond condescending. 401ks have been around since the early 80s, and Americans have learned that the market goes up and the market goes down, and that's just part of the deal. A bad year doesn't mean that your money is gone or wiped out. The second issue is that this may have been the point where history began to be revised and where the privatization of Social Security became a Republican idea. Later, it specifically became George Bush's idea.
The first thing we have to do is prevent the Republicans ever from privatizing it. They are still determined to privatize Social Security. You know, Harry remembers after Bush got reelected in 2004, the first thing he said was, let's go privatize Social Security. I was one of the leaders in the Senate with Harry and others. We went around the country. We made it clear we would never let that happen. And you know what their whole plan was? Their plan was to give the Social Security Trust Fund to Wall Street. Imagine that. If you thought we had scandals and collapse before, think of that.
Now, this has been carried over into the Biden campaign as well and his plan for older Americans, where he said efforts to privatize the program, such as an approach suggested under the Bush administration, will undermine the program's solvency. But I don't want any of us to forget where this proposal originally came from. It wasn't George Bush that suggested this, as all of these people have said. Ironically, it was Bill Clinton.
By 2032, the trust fund will be exhausted, and Social Security will be unable to pay the full benefits older Americans have been promised. The best way to keep Social Security a rock-solid guarantee is not to make drastic cuts in benefits, not to raise payroll tax rates, not to drain resources from Social Security in the name of saving it. Instead, I propose that we make the historic decision to invest the surplus to save Social Security.
During the late 90s, he had a study group that suggested multiple fixes for Social Security, but the one he really liked was to invest part of the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, even then, there were a lot of people in the leadership of the Democrat Party that didn't like the idea, and when the Lewinsky issue and subsequent impeachment came up, President Clinton was forced to align with his party and abandon his dream of putting safeguards in place that would protect Social Security for the long term. Now, in multiple academic papers that followed, it was found that the deficit would have been closed completely by doing this. In retrospective data, a paper from the Boston College Center for Retirement Research illustrates that this plan would have been effective and we would not be in the place where we are today if it would have been enacted. In the same report, they said that investing the trust fund would still fix the issue, but then at the same time, we have reports from the Social Security Administration that say it wouldn't have much of an issue this late in the game. So there's some disagreement about whether or not this will work at this point. After all, it makes sense that the time value of money needs time to work, and we're waiting until the 11th hour here to get something done. So what difference could this have made? Well, we could dive into the research papers that clearly illustrate the benefits of investing the trust fund dollars. But to keep it simple, let's just compare the return of the trust fund versus the return of the stock market. Over the past 40 years, the trust fund has averaged a return of 6.95% per year. Now, that's not too shabby. But keep in mind that in the early 80s, there were some really high interest rates, and those bonds purchased inside the trust fund took a few years to get sold. Since then, the rates have come down substantially. For the past 3 years, the return has been under 3%, and that's where we expect it to be moving forward. When you compare that to the stock market over the same period, as measured by the S&P 500, there's a big difference in return. Over that same 40-year period, the return of the S&P 500 has been 13.19%. Now, right off, this certainly seems to be higher, but it's not just a world apart, right? Well, let's put this into dollars to see how different this return really is. If I would have had $1 million to invest at the beginning of 1980 and was given the choice of the stock market with all of its ups and downs, or just receive the same consistent return of the Social Security Trust Fund, here's how that would have worked out. My $1 million with the same return of the Social Security Trust Fund would have been worth more than $13 million. Not too bad at all. But my funds invested in the stock market would have been worth $67 million. And the trust fund didn't start at $1 million as we used in this example. It started at $26 million. And since 1980, there's been an additional $2.8 billion added to the trust fund from taxes that were in excess of the benefits required to be paid out. So imagine if that would have been added to the pool of investment dollars. So why hasn't this proposal made it any further? One word: politics. And now that we've waited all these years, knowing that we had a looming deadline, the only way to fix this is in a way that's going to cause pain for someone. So when that day comes, I want you to remember that it wasn't shifting demographics or any of the other common scapegoats that caused this problem. It was politics. And since we're talking about politics, let me tell you where I stand. I do tend to lean conservative, and a lot of you know that, but you also know that no one gets a blank check for my approval. Even though I have YouTube comments saying I'm a flaming liberal and other comments saying I'm a crazy right-winger, often all on the same video, I think that I have a responsibility to support the legislation that makes sense, even if it is from the other party. But everything now is framed as good or bad, liberal or conservative, black and white. We've gotten to a point where we feel bad for agreeing with a proposal from the party that we don't like, and we feel like we have to agree with everything that our chosen party likes. It's sad when the politicians say that we could never support that idea because that's the other guy's idea. If we start supporting the same ideas, the line between us is not going to be as defined. So good idea, but because it's not our idea, we can't support it. There is an in-between here, and unless we find it, we're going to have a disaster on our hands with Social Security. If we keep waiting, the only way to fix it will be a drastic benefit cut or tax increase. Now, the loudest voices calling for reform now are for those who are advocating for tax increases. Everyone should pay their fair share, they say. This kind of talk makes for really good campaign speeches and selling sweatshirts for $59, as AOC does on her website. But let me be clear. There isn't enough wealth out there to tax our way out of this problem. Instead, the often unintended consequences of targeting rich people with more taxes is going to be a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. This is because companies like the one that I own, who are more often than not owned by people who are defined as being rich, we're not likely to take a reduction to our net profit or pay. Instead, the increased costs of higher taxes are going to get passed on to employees through pay and benefit cuts, not hiring at all, or worse, firing employees to protect the bottom line. Make no mistake, tax increases sound great, but the cost of a tax increase will be borne by those who are wealthy, middle class, and those who are poor. To properly fix this system, it's going to require some courage from our elected leaders. They've got to get to a point where they are willing to examine all the options, including sacrificing their sacred cows. It's the only way to save the system. Well, my rant is over for now, but I want you to remember, this is your retirement. Please continue to learn and stay informed. And most importantly, continue to educate yourself and don't expect the government to do a better job than you on planning for your retirement. You can keep learning things by subscribing to this channel and then watching the other videos that I have. There's blogs out there, lots of great content that you can watch on this. But most of all, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a great day.